Go ahead and take it away, Alexa.
Absolutely. All right. Well, welcome, Jim. Thanks so much for being the brave one willing to get in the hot seat first.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad you have put this together. This is an important conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy for your involvement. So today you were hoping to talk about a little bit about the loving power of proximity. Can you tell us more about what you mean by that?
Well, it's being in the same room. It's being next to people who are different than we are. And that I've discovered in my own journey that when that happens, a real transformation can take place. I mean, I was raised, I suppose, as a traditional Nazarene, wasn't really that conscious or really aware of gay people in my life. And then I had a job 40 years ago as a public relations director at the Boston Ballet Company. And I worked alongside a principal dancer, a Black South African, and we traveled to South Africa together in the midst of apartheid. And Augustus was gay. And with my Nazarene background and my Nazarene credentials, I was a little apprehensive about what this would mean. But that relationship transformed my life. And I saw a man, an individual who was struggling with civil rights issues in this country, and plus his own sexuality. And then, of course, my stepson came out about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and have walked that journey with him. And in the course of my career, especially working politically, I have been in contact and around all kinds of people. And I'm very concerned about the whole concept of otherness that seems to find its way most expressed in the church. And I just returned from a major conference at the Aspen Institute, where I heard people who came from diverse faith backgrounds talking about the concept of belonging. And that to me is the critical piece here, is that we are all humans, and that the gospel at its very heart is about belonging. It's not about excluding. It's more than inclusion. It is about really engaging people and accepting them for their humanity, as Jesus did. And frankly, in the history of the church, I mean, my doctoral work was in church history. You know, this otherness began with the Council of Jerusalem. And we seem to continue to follow that path periodically in our history. So proximity to me is critically important. Brian Stevenson, in his book, Just Mercy, I worked with him on a number of projects, a couple of task forces, and he really stresses, especially in the civil rights movement, the importance of coming alongside people to understand them and to know them personally.
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how even inclusion isn't quite enough. What do you see as sort of the difference between inclusion and belonging, and how do you see that proximity really plays a role there?
Well, John Powell, a scholar out on the West Coast, I heard him put it this way this weekend, actually, or this week in this conference at the Aspen Institute. You know, he used the metaphor of a party, and exclusive is you're not invited to my party. You know, only certain people can be invited to my party. Inclusion is you can come to my party, you're invited to my party, but it's still my party. And belonging is we create the party together, we show up together, we celebrate together. It's both of us, it's all of us in that process. And I think the difference, we can tell people we love them, and even with the manual distinctions that have made in the last General Assembly, we got rid of some of the derogatory language. But in some ways, I think we did even more harm by simply saying, we're going to love you, but you can't have full participation at our party. You can't have full participation or assume responsibility if you choose a sexuality that for some people seems to be different. And I want them at the party. I want them to create the party.
Absolutely. So in your essay and also in your work with the 1908 Project, you've laid out some very specific steps that you think the church can take to reach that full belonging. Can you talk a little bit more about how we host this party together?
Yeah. Well, I think reaching out to the LGBT community in your local community, showing up at Pride events. I mean, in a couple of weeks, the church I'm attending, we are delaying our service so that we can participate in a pride march,
Mm.
walking alongside people that are different from us, who believe differently from us, and having that conversation, reaching out to individuals, engaging them, having conversations within even the traditional church framework where people would be willing to be open to a conversation. I mean, the 1908 Project, whether it was Christian nationalism, whether racism, whether the LGBTQ issue, or the death penalty, or state-sponsored executions, and the next issue we're going to be taking on is the issue of guns. We have to have a conversation. And what's frustrating is the fact that people won't have the conversation. They're so entrenched in a belief system or a bias that completely eliminates the possibility of a sustained conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in thinking through sort of my own experiences in the Nazarene church, it's been a real realization of the silence around this issue. You know, there's less, at least from my experience growing up, concrete hatred or negativity that I've experienced, and more just unwilling to talk about it at all. So can you talk any about some successful interactions you've had trying to start those conversations, maybe within your church or with sort of friends or family members who disagree, who are not affirming?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. My stepson grew up Mormon, LDS, and then he went to a Nazarene college. And at Nazarene college, he encountered rejection, and an evangelist speaking in church talked about the need for him to be healed and what that meant to him. And in the course of this, now I live in Utah. I left Washington, D.C. 4 years ago, and I now live in Utah, in the heart of LDS country. And a lot of my work in Utah is with LDS young adults and also LDS leaders. We have formed what's called the Halcyon Group, which is a group willing to discuss these kinds of issues. And we have seen major transformation of people who are active LDS engaged in a conversation around full inclusion and participation and belonging, the concept of engaging and accepting people for who they are in their humanity, not by some label. And I think that's one of the frustrating things, is the labels and the tags that we use to completely to define each other. And it's the heart of otherness. And so I've seen some real transformation in that process, including a way certain state legislators have changed their voting patterns around inclusion, around transgender issues, and beginning to take an openness or an attitude of openness to see that they may have been wrong. I know 40 years ago I was wrong, and I continue to believe, as I relate to people in various contexts and various positions that I work with, that in a conversation and you create that proximity awareness, you just, I mean, I've said quite often, I don't know in terms of how the kingdom of God's going to shake out, but wherever my son Stephen is standing, that's where I'm going to be standing. Because he is a follower of Jesus, and we participated in his marriage last August to his partner, which was an amazing spiritual celebration. It was made up of many ex-Nazarenes, Nazarenes, and LDS. It was just an amazing experience. And being around him and being engaged in this conversation is transformative.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing. Well, we're about to wrap up here, but I have one final question for you. Speaking of your son, Stephen, what does he think of your involvement in this book and in the 1908 Project?
He loves it. In fact, as I wrote this section in the book, because I referenced his experience at ENC, I consulted with him. Do I have the facts right? Do I have the data right? And I will often, if there are issues, as things emerge, particularly in the LGBTQI community, he and I talk about it. In fact, I wrote a major publication for the Department of Justice on police relationships with the LGBTQ community. And I consulted with Stephen and several of his friends in terms of experiences, adverse experiences they had had with law enforcement because they were queer. And it influenced heavily that publication we did for the Department of Justice.
Wow, that's really exciting. We really appreciate all the work you're doing out there, and it's inspiring to hear how effective that's been. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for having me.